at my husband's funeral as the hymn played, and I stood there in my black dress, holding back tears. My daughter leaned close to my ear. Her words cut deeper than the grief already breaking my heart. She told me I had two choices. Either I find a job or get out of her house. What kind of daughter says that to her grieving mother? In desperation, I agreed to become the caregiver of a paralyzed billionaire. On the very first night, I froze at what happened. I'm glad to have you here. Stay with me till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far the truth really spreads. My name is Evelyn Parker, and I am 70 years old. Just 3 months ago, I buried my husband, the man I'd spent almost 5 decades loving cooking, for worrying about, and building a life with. I thought the hardest part would be saying goodbye to him that morning at St. Mary's Chapel, standing at the front of the church in my black dress, clutching the folded flag they handed me after the service. But as it turns out, the hardest part wasn't the funeral at all. It was what came after, when my only daughter leaned down during the final hymn, her perfectly painted lips brushing my ear, and told me I had two choices. Either I got a job, or I got out of her house. I remember how her breath was warm against my cheek as she whispered it like it was nothing, like she was asking me to pass the salt. My knees went weak under me, and I had to sit back down before the last verse ended, staring at the stained glass windows through a blur of tears. The whole drive back to her house was a haze. I don't even remember if she said another word. Her husband and 2 boys rode in silence like nothing had just shattered between us. That evening, I stood in her kitchen staring at the coffee pot, trying to keep my hands steady enough to pour. I still had my black coat on, still felt the dampness of the cemetery clinging to my skin. I could hear Lindsay laughing on the phone in the living room, like she hadn't just humiliated me in front of God. The cup slipped from my fingers and shattered on the tile coffee, splattering across my shoes, dark and bitter. I sank down and started gathering the pieces, my fingers trembling, a lump in my throat so big I thought it might choke me. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it, like my presence in her home was some kind of burden she'd been waiting to shake off. Like the 22 years I'd spent raising her didn't matter now that her father was gone, and she didn't have to pretend to care anymore. My own daughter, the baby I'd rocked through fevers, the little girl who once begged me to sleep on the floor by her bed after nightmares, was now standing at my husband's grave, telling me to pack my things. That night, when I finally lay down on the stiff twin bed in her guest room, I stared at the ceiling until dawn. I kept thinking about that moment in the church, about the words I can't stop hearing. Get a job, or get out. What kind of daughter says that to her grieving mother? And how do you ever look at her the same way again? I still remember the day I brought Lindsay home from the hospital, swaddled in a thin pink blanket I'd sewn myself because we couldn't afford store-bought extras. She was so tiny, her little fist gripping the collar of my nightgown, as if she already knew the world outside. My arms was colder than she wanted. From that first night, it was like my whole life rearranged itself around her needs, and I never once thought to question it. When she was 6 months old, I went back to work full-time at the hospital. The only job they had open was nights in the emergency room, so I took it and figured out how to nap while she napped in the afternoons. Every morning, I would come home just as the sun rose, pick her up out of her crib, and rock her back to sleep before putting myself to bed. Sometimes I was so tired my eyes burned, but those hours of holding her in the quiet made it feel worth it. By the time she started kindergarten, I was picking up double shifts every weekend. I packed her lunches with little notes tucked in the napkins, bought her new shoes when mine had holes in them, and stayed up sewing Halloween costumes when everyone else in the house was asleep. We never had much, but she always had what she needed. She was the only kid at her birthday parties who never noticed her mama was sitting in the back with dark circles under her eyes. I remember one year when she turned 16, she begged me for a used Honda that a neighbor was selling. I'd been setting aside $20 here and there for years without telling her, and the look on her face when she saw the keys in a ribbon on the counter was something I'll never forget. I didn't even care that I had to skip paying the gas bill that month to make it happen. She was my only child, and it felt like she was worth every sacrifice. When she got accepted to the University of South Carolina, I cried in the parking lot of the admissions office. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college. I picked up extra shifts on the oncology floor to cover her tuition, sometimes staying overnight for 3 days straight, sleeping in a cot between rounds. My own birthday passed by 3 years in a row without so much as a slice of cake, but I never let hers go uncelebrated. Every February, I ordered her favorite strawberry shortcake from the bakery, even if it meant peanut butter sandwiches for me the rest of the week. When she got married, she asked if we could have the reception in the backyard, and I worked for weeks cleaning stringing lights through the trees, planting flowers so it would look just right. I handed her my credit card for the caterer and never once thought about what it would cost me later. That was the same house we'd bought when she was a baby, the house I'd scrimped and saved to make a home. The deed might have her name on it now, but every inch of it was built on my sleepless nights. Looking back, I can see all the little ways I let myself disappear for her. The clothes I didn't buy, the nights I didn't sleep, the birthdays I didn't celebrate. I thought that was what mothers were supposed to do. You give and trust they'll remember who gave it all to them. And maybe that's why her words at the funeral hurt so much. Because I couldn't help but wonder if she ever remembered any of it at all. At first, it was little comments she thought I wouldn't hear. She would walk past me in the hallway, sigh just loud enough, and mutter about how cramped the house felt these days. I would be folding laundry in the living room, and she'd tell her husband she couldn't wait to have her space back, like I was nothing more than an overstuffed piece of furniture she planned to move to the curb. When I moved into her guest room after my husband passed, I kept quiet about the fact that she'd already started redecorating the master bedroom before the funeral was over. The bed I'd shared with my husband for 45 years was suddenly hers, the walls stripped of our wedding photo before I could even pack it away. I told myself she was just grieving in her own way, but each night, when I lay on the stiff mattress in that tiny room, I could hear her laughing on the phone, talking about paint colors and curtains, like my whole life hadn't been dismantled for her convenience. She started calling me a burden one morning over breakfast. It was a word that slipped out of her mouth like it had been waiting there for years. Her boys sat at the table silent, pretending to be interested in their cereal, while I stared at my plate and tried to swallow around the knot in my throat. She went on about bills and utilities and how expensive everything was now that there were 3 adults in the house. On weekends, she'd have friends over for dinner and make little jokes about her live independent. Her guests would smile politely while she poured wine and made sure they all knew how much she was sacrificing to take care of me. I'd sit quietly at the end of the table, picking at my food, feeling smaller every time they laughed at one of her remarks. She never said it outright, but she didn't have to. Every word told me I didn't belong anymore. I tried to help where I could. I offered to pay what little I got from Social Security, but she scoffed at the amount, saying it wouldn't even cover the water bill. I cooked meals, I cleaned, I even babysat her boys when they wanted to go out for the evening. But no matter what I did, it was never enough to stop the way she looked at me, like I was some obligation she couldn't wait to be rid of. The final weeks before she gave me the ultimatum were the worst. She stopped speaking to me except when she had something to complain about. The boys stopped hugging me goodnight too, like they'd learned from her how to look through me instead of at me. I started spending more time in my room just to keep out of her way, listening to the quiet resentment in her voice every time she passed my door. It hurt most at dinner, sitting there, while she listed off her daily inconveniences to her husband like I was part of a grocery list. She would glance at me and smile that tight smile she wore in front of the kids, then turn right back to her complaints about how long I'd been staying and how hard it was to keep the lights on. I wanted to speak up. I wanted to remind her who paid for the house she was sitting in. But the words never came. By the time she told me to leave or find a job, I wasn't even surprised. The humiliation had been building for weeks, cutting into me little by little until it was almost a relief to hear her say it outright. At least then, I didn't have to keep pretending anymore. At least then, I knew for certain she really did see me as nothing more than a burden. The morning she told me to leave the air in the kitchen was sharp and cold. I had just set out 2 plates of toast when Lindsay sat down across from me and pushed hers aside without even looking at it. She smoothed her blouse, adjusted her wedding ring, and said it like it was a simple fact. "You need to find somewhere else to stay, Mom. You've got 2 weeks. I froze, my hand still gripping the back of the chair, trying to process her words. 2 weeks. After everything. After raising her in this very house, after paying the mortgage every month while she chased her career. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. She stood, grabbed her coffee to go, and added over her shoulder that she had already made up her mind. I spent the rest of the day in my room, staring at the walls while the sun moved across the window pane. Around noon, I started to pack. The closet door creaked as I slid it open and pulled down an old suitcase, the same one I'd used when I brought her to college. My hands trembled as I folded my clothes and set them inside. I could hear her in the other room, laughing on the phone, her voice light and easy, as though nothing had changed. When she passed my doorway later that evening, she stopped and watched me for a moment. I couldn't tell what was in her eyes. Pity, maybe. Or just satisfaction that she was finally getting what she wanted. I kept my head down, pressing my sweaters flat, and she didn't say a word before walking on. That night, I cried quietly into my pillow so the boys wouldn't hear. I felt like a stranger in the house I'd built, like an intruder in my own life. I told myself I'd figure something out, but in the pit of my stomach, I knew I had nowhere to go. The next morning, I walked to the grocery store just to get out of the house. There was a corkboard near the door with flyers for babysitting dog-walking yard work. One caught my eye. Private caregiver needed for elderly gentlemen. Live-in, generous salary, room and board included. I stood there reading it over and over, my heart beating hard. When I got home, I called the number at the bottom and left a message. My voice sounded strange to me on the machine, small and thin. That night, I could barely sleep. My hands ached from gripping the phone, and my mind kept replaying Lindsay's cold stare as I packed my suitcase. 2 days later, I got a call back. The woman's voice was brisk, polite. She said I could come for an interview the next morning. The address she gave me was in the wealthiest part of town near the river. My stomach twisted as I hung up. When I arrived, the mansion took my breath away. It sat at the edge of the water, white and gleaming with wide steps and black wrought iron railings. The driveway was lined with oaks draped in Spanish moss, and I felt suddenly small as I walked up to the front door. A housekeeper answered and ushered me inside. The air smelled faintly of polish and lavender, and every surface sparkled like it had been scrubbed to perfection. She led me down a long hall into a sitting room where sunlight spilled across a gleaming wood floor. Then she announced me. "Mrs. Parker, sir. The candidate." The man by the window turned his chair slowly to face me. He was older than me by a few years, maybe early 70s, with silver hair and broad shoulders. His eyes were striking a pale blue that seemed to cut right through me. I froze under his gaze, my breath catching in my chest. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his brow furrowed slightly, and his voice low and deep filled the room. "You look familiar." "Do I know you?" Something inside me shifted, but I didn't know why. I swallowed hard, forcing a polite smile. "I don't believe so, sir." But even as I said it, I felt my hands begin to shake, and his eyes stayed locked on mine, searching for something I couldn't name. That evening, after dinner, I sat alone in the quiet guest room they had given me. The curtains were drawn, and the soft sound of the river outside filled the air. My suitcase was still half packed from Lindsay's house. I hadn't bothered to unpack fully, unsure if this job would even last more than a few days. My hands felt restless, searching for something to do, and that's when I noticed the photo album peeking out from the corner of my bag. It was a simple leather-bound book cracked at the edges from years of use. I had thrown it into the suitcase at the last moment, not even sure why. It had been sitting on my nightstand for months, a reminder of days I rarely let myself think about. I set it on my lap and opened the cover, flipping past the more recent pages. Pictures of Lindsay as a baby, birthdays, my wedding day with Robert smiling next to me. But the deeper I went, the older the memories became, and soon I found myself staring at a face I hadn't seen in almost 50 years. The picture was faded, but his smile still felt alive. Billy. His arm was draped around me, my head tilted back in laughter, wearing that yellow sundress I had sewn the summer we met. My heart stopped as I stared at his familiar blue eyes, the same eyes that had pierced through me earlier that day by the window. I let my fingers trace the outline of his face on the page, my chest tightening. I turned more pages, finding picture after picture of the two of us. Billy handing me a cherry Coke at Murphy's Diner. Billy teaching me to dance barefoot in my parents' tiny kitchen. Billy kissing me goodbye on the train platform with his suitcase at his feet, promising he'd be back in 2 years. I hadn't looked at these photographs in decades, convinced long ago that whatever we'd had was just a childhood fantasy that hadn't survived the weight of time. But now, sitting in that guest room, I felt my cheeks wet with silent tears as I realized I had been wrong. The next morning, I found him in the library, sitting in his chair with a book resting in his lap. He looked up when I entered, his blue eyes locking onto mine again, with that same searching expression. I stood there for a long moment before walking closer, the photo album clutched to my chest. I sat down across from him, my hands trembling as I opened the book to that first picture of us. I held it out for him to see, my throat too tight to speak. His gaze dropped to the page, and I watched the color drain from his face. His hand, still strong despite the years, reached out to touch the image. For a few seconds, he didn't say a word. Then his voice came low and rough, breaking slightly at the edges. "The yellow dress? You always looked beautiful in that yellow dress." Something inside me broke hearing him say it. I looked into his eyes, and for the first time since I walked into this house, I let myself truly see him. The sharp lines of his face, the silver in his hair, all layered over the boy I had loved so fiercely. Billy. I whispered his name, and he flinched like it hurt to hear it. He closed his eyes and let out a shaky breath. "I thought I was dreaming when you walked through that door yesterday. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But you're here. You're really here." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. My hands gripped the photo album, knuckles white as tears spilled down my cheeks. He opened his eyes and looked at me like I was a ghost. "I never stopped looking for you, Evelyn. Not a day went by that I didn't wonder where you were." I swallowed hard, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I thought you forgot about me." The letter stopped. I waited, Billy. I waited as long as I could, but you never came back. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't respond. Then his shoulders sagged as if the weight of all those years had finally caught up to him. "They took them. My business partners. They told me a girl like you would hold me back, that you'd never fit into the life they were building for me. They intercepted my letters, convinced me you'd moved on. By the time I realized what they had done, you were married." The words hit me like a physical blow. All those years I'd spent telling myself he hadn't loved me enough to keep his promise, only to find out the truth was something crueler. I covered my mouth with my hand, trying to hold back a sob. "You came back." His eyes softened glassy with unshed tears. "I did. I came back, and you were already his. I couldn't take you from him, so I stayed away. But I watched from a distance. Always." I shook my head in disbelief, my heart breaking all over again. "You watched me." He nodded, his voice quiet now. "I knew when Lindsay was born. When you bought the house. When your husband got sick. I knew everything, but I stayed away because I thought it was what you wanted." I wiped my cheeks with the back of my hand, my chest aching. "All these years, and you were there." His lips curved into the faintest smile, though his eyes were still full of sorrow. "I kept that yellow dress. I kept every letter you ever wrote me, every memory, because even though I lost you, I couldn't let you go." I reached out, then my fingers brushing over his hand. It felt warm and familiar, like slipping back into a memory I thought I'd forgotten. His thumb moved over mine, slow and tender, and in that moment, I felt 17 again. We sat there in silence, two people with too many words left unspoken staring at the photograph between us. And in his eyes, I could still see the boy who once promised me the world and meant it. Moving into William's mansion felt both strange and natural all at once. The guest room I'd stayed in during my first days was emptied, and I was given a warm suite just across the hall from his overlooking the river. I unpacked slowly, hanging my dresses in a closet bigger than my entire bedroom at Lindsay's house, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the weight of someone watching and waiting for me to leave. Lindsay called the first evening I moved in, her number flashing on the screen over and over while I sat quietly on the edge of the bed. I didn't answer, letting it ring until it stopped, then letting it ring again. The voicemail notifications piled up, each one sharper than the last, her voice clipped and accusing as she demanded to know what I thought I was doing. When I finally picked up on the fourth day, she didn't even say hello. She started in immediately, her voice high and cold as she called me a gold digger, telling me I was embarrassing myself and dragging our family name through the mud. I let her talk, holding the phone loosely against my ear, staring out the window at the river glinting in the afternoon sun. Her words cut in places, but I didn't let her hear that. I only told her that I was safe and that she didn't need to worry about me anymore. That only made her angrier, and she snapped that if I thought this little scheme would earn me a penny, I was mistaken. That's when I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked up to see William watching me, calm but firm, holding out his hand for the phone. I hesitated, then placed it in his palm. He didn't raise his voice as he spoke, but every word carried the weight of someone who was used to being listened to. He told her she would not speak to me that way again. He told her that I had earned more respect than she could ever imagine, and that no one, least of all her, had the right to question my place here. He paused, then letting the silence stretch before saying one last thing. He told her that if she truly cared about me, she'd think twice before calling again, with her venom disguised as concern. Then he ended the call and handed the phone back to me, his fingers warm against mine. I stared at him for a moment, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Protected. Seen. He only nodded, his expression softening as he told me I didn't have to explain anything to her anymore. That night, as I lay in my new bed and listened to the quiet hum of the house, I felt a quiet strength settle in me. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an apology for wanting to stay. Lindsay showed up at the mansion one gray afternoon unannounced and brimming with the kind of confidence only she could wear like armor. I watched from the window as she slammed her car door and strode up the walk, her heels sharp against the stone path. She didn't bother knocking politely, instead letting herself in and demanding to see me, her voice echoing through the grand hall. I met her at the foot of the staircase, and she wasted no time laying into me. Her words came fast, bitter, and dripping with accusation, calling me a fraud, a parasite, a woman willing to sell herself for comfort. I let her rant without interrupting, letting each cruel word roll off my shoulders, even as my hands tightened at my sides. William wheeled himself into the room just as she drew a shaky breath, his presence quiet but commanding. He glanced at me, then at her, and his voice cut through the room like a blade. "That's enough." Lindsay froze, startled by the steel in his tone, but then her lips curled into a sneer as she turned on him, accusing him of being blinded by my supposed schemes. Her words didn't shake him. He waited for her to finish, then reached into his desk and pulled out a thick envelope. He set it in front of her and told her it contained his final will. Every dollar of his estate, he explained evenly, would be going to charity. The Children's Hospital, a scholarship fund, an animal rescue. Not a penny would go to me. Not a penny would go to her. I watched the color drain from her face as she opened her mouth, then closed it again. William's voice softened as he turned to me and said that he knew my love wasn't for sale and never had been. He looked back at Lindsay and told her that if she couldn't see that it said more about her than it did about me. The silence stretched thick and heavy until Lindsay finally stood straighter, her cheeks blazing with humiliation. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed out her heels, clicking furiously down the hall. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of the front door slamming shut. Then William reached for my hand, his fingers steady and sure, and I let myself breathe again. The day William and I were married was quiet and simple, just as we both wanted. The ceremony was held in the conservatory with the morning sun pouring through the glass, and only a few close staff members standing as witnesses. I wore a soft cream dress and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd chosen himself. And when he slipped the ring onto my hand, my heart felt light in a way it hadn't in years. We shared a quiet dinner afterward, just the two of us. And he told me he'd never stopped imagining this moment, even after all the decades apart. I believed him because I'd secretly dreamed of it too, though I'd never dared say it out loud until now. In his eyes, I saw the boy who once promised me the world, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had truly come home. A week later, Lindsay called asking if she could come by. Her voice was subdued, stripped of the edge it always carried, and though I hesitated, I told her yes. When she arrived, she stood awkwardly in the doorway for a long moment before finally looking up at me and saying she was sorry. We sat together in the formal living room, and she told me she had been wrong, that she had let her pride and her bitterness cloud what mattered most. Her hands trembled when she said she missed me, that she missed her mother. I listened quietly, letting her words sink in, and when she finally looked at me with tears in her eyes, I took her hand. I told her I forgave her, because that's what a mother does. But I also told her something I'd never said before. That forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean going back to the way things were. If she wanted to be part of my life now, she would have to accept my choices and respect them, even if they weren't what she wanted for me. For a long moment, she only nodded her shoulders, slumping in quiet understanding. When she left that evening, she hugged me tighter than she had in years. As the door closed behind her, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me, knowing I had finally drawn my own lines and chosen my own happiness. If you've stayed with me through this story, I just want to say thank you. It's not easy to talk about the moments in your life when you feel invisible, when even the people you love most make you believe you're nothing but a burden. I thought that was my fate, to quietly fade into the background just to keep the peace, but I was wrong. I've learned that no one has the right to decide your worth for you, no matter who they are. You deserve to be seen, to be respected, and to be loved without conditions. It took me 70 years and a lot of heartache to finally stand up for myself. But I promise you, it's never too late to start choosing yourself. So to anyone out there feeling small or unwanted, please hear me when I say this. You are not a burden. You have every right to take up space and every right to find your own happiness. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet? Or would you have walked your own path, even when it hurt? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them below. Thank you again for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you to never let anyone, not even family, make you forget your own worth.